certain damage is probably done, or a certain trust is destroyed.
You need to have this narrative, then you need to have people buying into this joint narrative.
Hinges a little bit on the fact of how we think about the voter.
I think the biggest challenge is actually to make the voters think European.
Trump has been a very effective political communicator. The question is a little bit how that blame game will go. The swing voters now have a real idea that it's Trump's tariffs that is bringing up prices. So I think that makes him very vulnerable.
It's great to have you here to discuss with you and talk how you think about it. The new US administration is moving fast to change the terms at which the biggest economy on the world is interacting with other countries and other regions, and that also affects Europe. It's great to have you here, Catherine, Markus, to discuss that point with you and talk how you think about it. Catherine, you have widely published on the interaction between national politics and international affairs, extreme movements and political entrepreneurship. And Markus, you have outstanding research on macroeconomics more broadly, but also on crisis and on resilience. So this is a topic for a discussion between the three of us and how we look at the current situation. So when we look at the policy action of the Trump administration, of the new administration, how should we understand it? Is it a tectonic shift that will last? Or is it rather a sequence, a flurry of actions of a political entrepreneur who is very stern in his actions? How do you understand what's currently going on?
So I would say it's not adjusting at the edges, it's really disrupting the system. It's disrupting, the global world order in politics terms, but also in the economy through tariffs and many, many other measures. They really want to set up a new system, moving away from a multilateral, rule-based system to much more a bilateral, transactional system.
Yeah, but that's transactional. Is it going to last? Or just, again, this can still be a flurry of different steps. You said there is an intention behind it, so it's a systemic change.
I think we have seen from the first Trump administration that then Biden actually continued with the old tariffs. So some elements will surely last. I hope some elements there will be a U-turn. So it's very hard to predict at this point whether it will be destroying the current world order and replacing it ultimately with a new one, or we will partially go back to the old one.
I mean, for me personally, but that also is a question to you. If you move into political science, or if you look into the electoral base, my hunch would be that there is a strong electoral base in the US that is supportive to this kind of policy, and this will stay. That's the structural element. And then you have different entrepreneurs that play on it, more or less, but you cannot get rid of it. So that is also politically lasting. Would you share that?
No, I mean, I very much agree with Markus, what has been said, that it's a disruption across the board. So political entrepreneurs disrupt politics, and actually in comparison to Trump 1 to Trump 2, or his first and second administration, is that he seems to have no longer guardrails to really disrupt his own political order inside the United States, also attacks on rule of law, attacks on even people who are legitimately in the country, and concerns that political scientists have about democracy in the United States, and the same goes for that international order. But I do think that you're right in the sense that if we think about Trump's effect on Europe, it's interesting. So in one way you could say, well, this should give kind of resonance with a lot of populist far-right leaders in Europe that have very similar ideas to Donald Trump. But here we see a little bit of a mixed bag. There might be some people like, for example, the Italian Prime Minister Meloni that's trying to be a Trump whisperer, but we also actually see in recent polling that actually support for mainstream parties has gone up, because actually Europeans are maybe not that sure about the level of disruption that they're seeing and the potential consequences that it has for Europe through tariffs or through other matters. So the interesting aspect is that, as you say, you see strategic shifts, but it doesn't mean that in Europe now, even if people will go back to mainstream, it's because they have just, all their grievances has disappeared. But you see kind of strategic reactions to what's happening in different countries. So what's happening in the US has an effect on Europe, but how that will play out in the long run is not clear yet.
Perhaps I can just add something to that. It seems like Trump is much more a unifier for Europe than he is a divider. So if you look at Elon Musk and the interventions he did in Germany, in the UK and all that, they really try to divide Europe. But I don't think it's really leading to a division. It actually leads to more unification of Europe.
No, that is true. I mean, also this attempt of playing, so to speak, national politics didn't work, didn't go really well. I mean, you make that point about the European political entrepreneurs, but if I think even about the question of Trump himself and the economic consequences of the policies, right, is for me the point, is this sustainable in the US? I mean, we see the impact of uncertainty, we see how economists think about tariffs and the negative repercussions.
So I can imagine a scenario that we go into a recession and in a stagflation and with high inflation, that actually there will be huge political pressure for a U-turn. And I wouldn't rule it out that we actually will have a U-turn in the United States as well. So I don't think the majority is in favor. The majority of the people, they don't think about the international global world order and how this is multilateral or bilateral. For them, it's just they want to have low inflation, they want to have good education, they want to have their kids that they can grow up. And if this is not delivered, I think the majority will swing back to some other party. The problem is a little bit on the Democratic side. They have not provided a vision what the alternative would be. The campaign was very much, oh, let's prevent Trump from becoming president in the past campaign. But so far, they're lacking a new vision. And if there's a new vision laid out, which also helps the middle class, then I think there could also be a U-turn.
Plus the fact that, as you said before, some of those policies were already there before, and there's actually some bipartisan consensus. So it would not be 100% reversal. It would be just maybe a change in style or less dramatic and more friendly, but not 100% reversal.
You have to, even though if I say there's, certain damage is probably done, or a certain trust is destroyed, I don't see that the Canadians will say, okay, we go back to the old arrangement and make us totally dependent on the United States in economic interactions. So there is a reaction, you have some national feeling in Canada, very pronounced, and this probably will not go away immediately. So you can't go back fully, so something will remain.
So I do think it hinges a little bit on the fact of how we think about the voter. So the voter is rational in the sense that it cares about bread and butter issues, or in the United States, it's the price of eggs at the moment, right? So just inflation and what happens in the supermarket. But I think there's also a part where we know that voters are not just geared by that, right? So Trump has been a very effective political communicator, partly because his own background is in entertainment, and he's been, he kind of has this idea, and maybe in the US literature we call it the vibe of the country, and that is also to do with attacks on DEI, attacks on big universities that they see as being out of touch, anti-elite sentiment. So the question is a little bit how that blame game will go. I think it was actually, I was quite surprised how quick out of the kind of woodwork he came with doing all this, because it's clear that Trump did this. And that would, me as a political scientist, would say, well, that makes you very vulnerable for the kind of dynamics you guys were just talking about, which is the fact that voters are going to blame you for the inflation. If he is able to kind of say, well, that's not me, but it's out of all other sources, or it's, someone else who's doing it, he might have a chance with at least a part of his base to get away with this. But I think the swing voters now have a real idea that it's Trump's tariffs that is bringing up prices. So I think that makes him very vulnerable.
Let me just add to this. Of course, he has another card to play. He might just, invade another country or Greenland, and this might draw the attention away from if the economy is not doing well. So the economy could be one correcting factor, or the financial markets could be a correcting factor, but he might just manage the attention of the voters in such a way that, the attention is all drawn to something else, and then, it can survive this.
I mean, that part, what you're just saying, that moving it from economics to politics brings us to another important point, and that relates to Europe. If we think about the impact of that policy on Europe, what is the predominant impact? And the other question for me, key question is, what is the right response? I mean, in general, economically, you say it's resilience, but politically, maybe it needs a robust answer, and you need to just kind of not get on your knee, which may bring up trade-offs. So how can we position ourselves? What is a good European reaction to this policy? In your book, you have it nice. I think you put it, it's the difference between being an oak and wheat, right? So the oak is there and stands there, and the wheat bends with the wind, but comes always back.
That's correct, yes.
It's very clear that there needs to be a narrative around the response. So one is the question of what the response is. And I think actually we've seen that maybe the US also got unintended consequences of their actions with bringing the Europeans stronger together than they initially were. We have to see how that lasts. But that kind of reaction needs to have a face. You know, the old Kissinger saying, like, who do I call in Brussels, or who is responsible? I think Ursula von der Leyen, as the Commission President, is doing a lot in the communication, but that doesn't necessarily resonate with individual voters that say in Poland, in Spain, in the Netherlands, that might not speak the language, that are not following so close, you know, attention to politics. So it also has to be a kind of domestic national response. And here you do see differences, is that national politicians have very little incentive to basically say, well, I'm not doing it here, but Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen is doing the response, right? So they are going to try to claim a lot of that response, which is not necessarily maybe saying it's a European coordinated response, but it's something that I've done. I've created a Zeitenwende, or I have overcome a Schuldenbremse, if you think about it in Germany or in other countries, how they associate to that. So there's a little bit of a, let's say, capacity to act, and then having the narrative around selling this to voters as the right way to respond.
So the two key issues that we are facing is basically trade and defense at this stage. And say for trade, it's very clear this is in Europe, is an EU responsibility. So we had seen Liberation Day and the tariff announcements that came with it. And the EU reaction has to be done by the European Commission. It has to be formulated by the European Commission. And that is why it's a European issue, how stern you want to be. And I mean, if I talk to my economist, and probably most economic models would say, if you retaliate, you can do it, but you must be aware there's a certain economic cost that comes with it.
It's true that, you know, all the trade issues are European issues. That's actually a good advantage that actually can help to unify Europe further, because it's, you know, in the Rome of Europe. But it's also the case that the Trump administration really, in the trade issues, tries to divide Europe. They want to approach individual countries, country by country. They know, of course, if you approach individual countries, they have a bigger sway rather than, you know, all of Europe together. And so it will be a challenge to keep Europe together as well, because there will be certain French interests or certain German interests and Italian interests not to use this particular products as a countermeasure, because that might backfire again and things like that. So there's a challenge, but that, you know, requires political leadership skills, and we hope that the European leaders have these skills to represent Europe as a whole.
But I think in addition to this, the fallout often of those, of, let's say, the cost of the retaliation or the counter tariffs, those are often not felt at the European level. Those will be felt by individual consumers or by individual companies in countries. And then you're going to get this issue again that actually that gets discussed within a national arena. They're not necessarily maybe going to blame Ursula von der Leyen for this, but they might blame the German Prime Minister or the Italian Prime Minister. So the political calculation for a European Prime Minister, even though Ursula von der Leyen is, you're exactly right, is standing there and discussing how we're going to respond as Europe towards that. But some of the fallout is going to be very domestic. And then the question is, how do you deal with that, especially when new horizons and the political business cycle comes close, and an election, either regional or either national, is coming on the horizon. And then you might see some fracturing of that European unity.
That is true, and certainly, Markus, when you refer to the issue, this possibility of divide and conquer, I mean, this is a real risk. But otherwise, actually, if I may say, the two-level game going on at this stage, to me, it still seems there may be an advantage in it. I mean, yes, often, kind of, so to speak, the Brussels blame is an issue, but here, having clear responsibility to which you can refer, also, I would say, gives some clarity. And if this kind of at least can continue, and let me just say, from my observation, one of the key experiences of the Brexit process was, I mean, it was also due to very skillful leadership, but also the united, if you wish, action with which this was kind of carried through on the European side, I thought was remarkable. Maybe there's also a good reason to have hope on that one, that actually one can keep it for the trade area, which is clearly defined as kind of a common initiative, and everyone understands that.
I should just add to this, of course, the European countermeasures, they will also try to hit certain states in the United States. So there's a similar situation, not so extreme, but also, in the US it will be similar that, certain governors will lobby then, the White House not to do this or to do that instead, because they will be hit by European countermeasures.
The point that you made on this claiming also national ownership, I think it's more of an issue when we move to the other area that plays a role, which is defense.
Absolutely.
And we have seen here big German initiative, and that moved markets significantly, so that there is much more need for policy coordination which at this stage is not there, and that is something very new to engineer. That is the way I would look at those different policy fields.
Yeah, but I think it has, even one could be pessimistic, but also raise some optimistic points there, just to kind of add to the conversation. But that, for example, you saw there was a motion in Dutch Parliament. I'm Dutch by birth, and the Dutch have not been necessarily known to be very supportive of any joint lending in this case, and said, well, we really are against any form of joint borrowing, even for defense. The Prime Minister overruled that because he said, well, this is just an extraordinary circumstance to do this. And one thing he added is actually, well, it doesn't really matter what we think because this is qualified majority voting, so it's just going to, go through. So there's some options in which at least the financing doesn't require unanimity in some of these areas, even though it's not an EU full response. The other aspect, I think, and that's really important, that you've seen now kind of coalitions of the willing. We've seen it, of course, with the UK, right? Because that's an important security power in Europe, but we see it also within the EU as such. We have now a phenomenon called G5+, which is the big 5 member states plus representatives of the European Union that met some time ago in Madrid that might, meet moving forward. Those are also countries that have some defense industry, so they might have an interest, of course, in organizing this in this way. But we're seeing some of the things that we've seen the EU do in other crisis periods is under pressure. A lot of things get fluid and a lot of different approaches develop. So I do think that there might be a possibility of kind of, let's say, muddling through, but you are right that the particular kind of politics of this could in the long run be more complicated. And I'm happy to discuss that, but you can think about kind of a narrative, if there's not a good narrative for the public of, there's going to be trade-offs. You can't spend €1 twice, so there's going to be some borrowing, but there also has to be some money flowing in, and we're not looking forward to high growth in the near future. So you could see a narrative developing if mainstream parties don't do it by kind of political entrepreneurs, either on the far left or the far right, saying, well, we're making sacrifices for Ukraine, or we're making sacrifices for other countries, and we are actually not being able to pay your bills, right? So you can see a kind of dynamic. It's very important for mainstream parties to get and nail a narrative around why this is needed, why it's needed in a European joint response, and why certain sacrifices have to be made, and that this is important for Europe's future. And I think there is where we see a little bit of lacking of leadership from national capitals.
Let me just add a few thoughts to that. I think what's important is when we do all this military investment, we should actually look at new technology spillovers. So we should really not buy old-fashioned tanks or something. We should really invest in new technology and also have a little bit of an eye on it. Will it spill over to the economy and help our growth prospects in the economy as well? So I can see, cyber aspects, many aspects, drones, where actually we can also, in collaboration with Ukraine, learn from their experience and build a more modern defense industry in Europe. And it might not be within the European Union. It might be a different institution needed because it has to include the United Kingdom as well. And this way, we can be stronger together. And this, I think I can see some steps going forward.
We have mentioned 2 areas, which is trade and defense. But overall, what is the policy package you would want to see, that I can also say what I want to see, from Europe in order to really make its future and be strong in the future? And how can that policy package win the necessary political support?
Yeah, so I think very much agreeing with Markus, it has to be kind of a 360s holistic kind of approach. We also have a growth problem, as the Draghi report outlined. We have an incomplete single market that Letta report outlined. So it will have to involve a lot of different elements. It can't only be defense.
No, but so then let's get in terms of priorities, right? So there will be a trade reaction. Is a trade reaction, has already started. then defense. And I think you made the point about also, obviously, we should try for defense to, as the economists say, to maximize the multiplier, right? Get as much growth out of this in the short term, in the long term as we can.
Yeah.
If we only buy the ships in the US, there is no gain. This is just kind of money sent somewhere else. Third point, single market. We agree on that. As kind of, this is what we can do, right? And
a 28th jurisdiction. I mean, there are a lot of ideas in the letter report that can be done and that are pretty, I would say, should be no regrets for the European Union.
By the way, there is also an interesting innovation on that, because when we, at least when it comes to capital market, there is now this issue of the 28th regime, right? So that you basically, you get access in one place and you can spread across countries, which can also be helpful in kind of making this worse.
And it's also very important actually for Europe, because in countries like Italy, in countries like Germany, you have a lot of small, medium-sized enterprises, and for them to get the know-how legally to trade in different jurisdictions is difficult. Actually, a lot of that would be solved by having a possibility of having a unified legal framework. It should be a no regret, I think, for many Europeans to do it.
I think we should also look at bureaucracy and complexity of decision making. We should get a framework where people can take more ownership on their own, and things are less complex. That relates also to resilience, because you have to react to things. And if you say, oh, do I satisfy these 25 rules and these 25 rules at each level, at the European level and at the national level, if there's a 28th regime, well, I have covered this regime and I'm set with it, that would actually help significantly. But we should also change, when you want to change a law in the European Parliament, you can put your name on the law. So there's more and more laws coming out because your name is on it. There should be some reward for removing laws or simplifying laws. You get the name on a simplified law.
I mean, at least there's an attempt made also from the European Commission side to kind of reduce at least the amount of regulation. I mean, having less regulation, there are 2 points that come with it. And here comes my perspective as a crisis resolution mechanism. Yes, we want to also deregulate maybe, or have less stringent rules, but we must still make sure we don't move back to quote unquote the old world, where all the risks end up with basically the taxpayer, and failure brings the government in. Okay, so we must stay safe. The other point is, if it were so easy, apart from the naming, but why isn't it done? Wasn't it done? And is there not still a bit of national resistance that we have then to overcome? And is this really winning?
Well, I think there's been two issues. One is the European Union has defined itself as a regulatory power. That has been, the so-called Brussels effect, and that was being seen, and that fits very much the old world order, not necessarily this new, more transactional world order. But the second part is what you allude to, which is that national regulators don't want to give up certain competences on certain levels. So we're duplicating a lot because we have stakeholders nationally that are not thinking European first, let's say. They're thinking, very nationally bound. And this is a crisis, a security crisis, an economic crisis in some ways as well, which we already had before, sluggish growth at least, that really will require us to think unified as a European continent, because scale is going to matter in this world that we are entering in.
I think the biggest challenge is actually to make the voters think European, because now there's a chance, or at least a threat, that will go back to the national, feel more secure at the national level. And if that happens, that's the biggest threat, I think, for Europe. Because there's threat from outside, and you can use the threat from outside to unify. But the biggest threat, I think, comes when the voter feels much more national. That, I feel more comfortable with my national leader. And there has to be some leadership at the European level, so that people, the voters, say, they're protecting us. They're actually doing the right thing. And managing that will require a lot of political skills.
You need to have this narrative, right? And you need to have people buying into this joint narrative, which in Europe can be some European leaders, but it must be the national leaders going along with it. So that unified voice.
We see it now just as an indication that many more Europeans, about 3/4 of them, understand who Ursula von der Leyen is. It used to be about 40 or 30% for previous Commission presidents, so she's done a big job in that, which of course COVID played a role in that, and Next Generation EU. So she's taken that, but she also needs to get the space to actually be heard in domestic media systems, which are often very national, and where national leaders are claiming their their kind of, successes and not necessarily a European success. So I think we need to move away, and that's going to be difficult for national leaders to basically see what is a success for Europe is also a success for Poland, is also a success for Spain, is also a success for Italy. That should not necessarily be seen as a trade-off or a zero sum, but as a win-win.
Can I just add to this? So what makes Europe way more complicated that there's a national media scene. No? You don't have essentially a European-wide media scene. But it might not change in the short run, but in the long run, the new technologies will help the translation softwares and make it so much easier just to read a newspaper from a different country, which you couldn't do in the olden days. So there might be some room through new technology to make the media more European rather than national. But this is a long-run project in a sense.
True, but another reason to actually embark on new technologies, which is something we have been calling for before. It shows also how much it is both an economic and a political initiative that we need really to formulate the right response. It has been super interesting talking to you. So thank you both very much for that conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.